you could read the first quotation.
Right. There are two ways of governing mankind. First, by keeping them ignorant. Secondly, by making them wise. Of course, he liked always to write in very simple sentences so that they would always be understood everywhere, but he also had a special resonance in those sentences, and that's also which helps to keep them alive, and I think you see it as we go along. Those who...
But what does this mean to the present times? Does this have any applicability?
Well, yes, I think he believes that a lot of governments spend a lot of time and maybe a lot of money trying to keep their multitudes of voters ignorant, and if they only apply their minds to allowing them to become wise, it could happen much more simply. But he did believe that much of what he was writing was addressed to the governments of his time, of course, who he believed was preventing people from learning the simple things of politics which they could translate into practical action. Almost everything he wrote was designed to achieve an immediate political result. Or this one, those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must undergo the fatigues of supporting it, which was a rebuke to those who thought they could make wonderful perorations about freedom but not do anything about it. And I dare say that's as up to date in the last decade of this century as it was 200 years ago, roughly, was when he wrote it. Or take this one, which has always been one of my favorites because it does the two things that I'm saying. It's simple so that everybody can understand every word, and indeed every word is of one syllable until the last word at the end, which gathers it all together. He said, "It is wrong to say God made rich and poor. He made only male and female, and he gave them the earth for their inheritance." No sentence could be more perfectly written in its balance than that one, with the sense absolutely clear and absolutely prevailing, right as fresh today as when he did it. Or this from that same, he wrote that sentence in a book called Agrarian Justice, which came out in the middle of the 1790s, and he wrote another passage there in that same book, which people don't often remember, which of course applies so directly to many of the things we can see around us today. He said, "The great mass of the poor in all countries are becoming an hereditary race, and it is next to impossible for them to get out of that state themselves. It is not charity, but a right that I am pleading for. The present state of civilization is as odious as it is unjust. It is absolutely the opposite of what it should be, and it is necessary that a revolution should be made in it. The contrast of affluence and wretchedness continually meeting and offending the eye is like a dead and living bodies chained together." How much is that opposite to what's happening in the United States or here in Britain or in so many places where the dead and the living seem to be chained together by circumstances, and where of course what he is seeking to do in the description of the facts is to arouse a fury that such a thing should be allowed to go on. Sometimes he was treated as if he was just interested in simple expression, but it's also he was also of course interested in preaching his message at the same time. It's because he did that so skillfully that everything that people tried to suppress it. Everybody, all the governments of the time, the French governments and the British government here even worse, and the American government, all of them at one time or another tried to suppress the works of Paine because they were being so well understood by the mass of the people then. And as we can see, that each of these things that he wrote about has got its absolute strict relevance today. If you take this one, mankind are not now to be told that they shall not think or they shall not read. Never has the attack on censorship been so plainly stated, and stated in a way in which he arouses very timely. He's stating the facts. He's stating also arousing a feeling against those who might try to operate a censorship which would stop men from thinking or stop men from reading. And by the way, he had himself a greater belief in the power of speech and the power of reading than anybody else. People believe from freedom for various different reasons, but he believed in the power of freedom, and he believed if only people had the chance to read what he and others said, of course he had thought especially of what he was writing, but other people too, if they had the right to read it, they would understand it, and that would change the whole world. And to some extent he proved it true. By the sheer power of his writing, he shook the governments wherever he went. United States, when he went there, first of all, the government that he shook by his writing then was the British government back here, across the road from here, which George III was trying to impose a tyranny and sustain it on the United States of America. This was before the word or the name of the United States had ever been heard. Indeed, Thomas Paine was the very first person who ever used the term the United States of America, which makes it all the more amazing, of course, that he should have been written out of the United States history books, because he had the term first. It was before the phrase was the proper term for describing the United States. He was the one who used it first and saw in it the power of what it would mean, of the way in which he could arouse the separate states as they were then, of course, of the across the Atlantic, against the power of George III here. But he thought if only he could get enough people to understand what he was saying and understand what his fellow great Americans were saying, Washington, Jefferson and the others, if he was the one who was more than anybody else translated it into words that people couldn't forget, and into words that are still alive today. I'm not saying anything against the other words that were used by some of the other greatest Americans of the time, in particularly, by the way, Thomas Jefferson. Some people think that he's the very greatest of all American presidents. That's certainly my belief, and he certainly played a major part, of course, in liberating the country, in particular by the Declaration of Independence, which has, right from the very time when it was written, remained the greatest document in the whole history of American freedom, and in a sense in world freedom. Now, partly that was written in association with Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was no doubt the first main writer of the Declaration of Independence, but at his side was Thomas Paine, who was helping the way in which was written, and indeed the language is very much the language of Thomas Paine, the same kind of plain, resonant language was that made the great American Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine played its part in that, and to do him justice, Thomas Jefferson, your greatest president, in my opinion, he never forgot the association that he had with Thomas Paine. He knew what service Thomas Paine had done to the American Revolution. Partly he made a major contribution to ensuring that revolution was victorious.
I'd like to jump a little forward to the present with these attacks on Paine in England in '68.
Yeah.
Talking about the 60s.
Yeah. Yes, well, it took a long time for different countries to recognize what Thomas Paine had done, and in many respects, the proper recognition hasn't been given to him. But way back in the 1960s in this country, there was no monument to Thomas Paine in this country at all. But some of us thought and got together. We had some assistance from the United States, by the way, because there was a major contribution was made to the statue that was put up outside Thomas Paine's own home at Thetford, just a few miles out in the town. We had this statue put up, and we thought that it was going to be received in the way that it should be. But the local council protested, or some members of the local council, and they had a ferocious debate. They said it was a desecration of the place, that there should be a commemoration of Thomas Paine. Well, of course, that just showed that there were some people on this side of the Atlantic who were just as ignorant about a history of their country, of our country, as were the Americans who'd defamed Paine on that side, but here's still the argument about his name was still going on in the 1960s, and when we put that monument up, they had a debate inside the Thetford Council, because it was Thetford where he was born, and the statue was going up just outside it. The statue, I'm glad to say, still stays there. There were some people who desecrated it, they would scrawl things over it, but the statue stands, and it stands as a sign that people are beginning to change their minds. By the way, right way back in the time when Paine was escaping into, when he escaped from this country because they put him on trial because of The Rights of Man, the book that he'd written, but when he crossed over into France, he was there during the period of the French Revolution. He got into trouble there very often sometimes with the revolutionaries, because he had the courage to say that they would be an act of terrible folly if they tried to execute the king and the queen. He was against the king and the queen, but he said it's quite wrong to execute them, and he got into some trouble on that account.
Yeah. Did you get that?
Paine's reputation in 92.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, well, 1792 was, I suppose, the most important date in the whole history of Thomas Paine's life, but also a very important one in the history of all of us, because that was the year just before the war broke out between the French Revolution, France and Britain here, and Thomas Paine wrote a book called The Rights of Man, which was published the end of 1791, beginning in 1972. It was the widest publication of any book published at the time, and it told the story of what had happened in France, and it was called The Rights of Man partly because it was defending the document on which the French had raised their revolution. Partly it was called The Rights of Man because it was translated into what he wanted to see happen here in England or in the United States of America, and it's also because it was the full revolutionary statement of what he thought the rights of men and women should be under any proper ordered government. Now, this was a revolutionary act for him to do here, and when soon after he'd completed it, the government here decided, it was a government over, it wasn't so much the government in the House of Commons, because the House of Commons was an extremely unrepresentative body. It was just a few of the top politicians and the top lawyers. They decided they were going to prosecute this book for treason, and they tried to suppress it that way. And Paine didn't stay to face the trial, not because he was afraid. Indeed, he said, if you want to put me on trial, you better come and do it. But he didn't. He wanted to get the circulation of the book increased, and he didn't believe at that time that they were going to take any measures against it. At any rate, he left the country then, went across to Paris, and thought he would be coming back again soon to England, but eventually he had to stay there, and he was...
Let me interrupt you and ask you, why was the British government afraid of a book?
Well, they were afraid of a book because partly they didn't like much... They didn't like books which didn't conform to their own ideas of how governments should be organized. And of course, American governments had been much like that too, and indeed the American Revolution was partly a revolt of the American people against the same kind of British government here. But Thomas Paine had played such a big part in the United States, and he'd seen the revolution succeed there, he'd seen independence established there, and he'd seen such a big change, and he'd seen it achieved by the publication of his 2 or 3 books there, one Common Sense and the other The Crisis, books which had helped to change the whole way in which America was governed. And so when he came back here, he thought he could do something of the same sort, especially when he crossed over to France and saw they were doing the same things there, and the publication of some of those books, Rousseau's books a bit earlier, and the books that comprised in it the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It doesn't sound like a revolutionary affair now. Everybody's supposed to believe in the rights of man, but the rights of man were only made popular, or made possible by people who campaigned for it. But still, the most reactionary government in the whole of the world at the time, the government which had tried to suppress the whole American Revolution, and which had tried to prevent Jefferson and Washington and all the others from having the success that they did, that same British government here was afraid of what Thomas Paine was going to do. His book, as I said, had a huge circulation. It was printed down the city of London there by some of the left-wing printers who used to try and print books to try and tell people what was really happening in their world. And of course they were the printers down there at that end of London were very much against the rulers up here, but that was the same kind of situation that had happened in Philadelphia, say 10 years before, when the people who'd be risen in Philadelphia against the British government had their success. So the British government were determined to try and stop him, and as a result of that they said that they were going to try Paine for high treason, and his book was going to be condemned as treasonable. Of course, the more they said that, the more people wanted to read the book, and the more they said it was an act of treason, the more there were other printers who were determined to print the book too. And so it was the pirates, as they were called, who came in to print the book, and there were hundreds of editions of The Rights of Man spreading all over the country and spreading these same revolutionary ideas. As I say, they would be called revolutionary ideas then, but they're commonplace ideas now. They were ideas of saying here people have a right to control their own government, to vote for their own government, to decide who they should be, and not to have it decided for them by kings and queens and lords who are not responsible to anybody. Now, this idea, which of course had helped to cause the American Revolution, the British government here thought it was going to cause a revolution here, and it did, but it took a bit longer here.
They were afraid of a kind of democracy. They were afraid of...
Yep. He didn't... Thomas Paine didn't use the word exactly democracy very often, and it wasn't not because he hated it, didn't like the word, but because it had hardly been invented. The words that he used to try and describe the same idea of democracy was these very words of the name of his book, The Rights of Man, and these were the words which had been used in Paris to describe the way in which people, if they used their rights, would be able to settle what kind of government they should have, instead of having all these matters settled by kings and queens and all these other people who hadn't got any real right to settle it. And he thought, that is Paine, thought that the revolution in America and the revolution in France and the revolution that he wanted to secure here were all part of the same democratic movement, and of course they were. But he was the link between these three revolutions. It was a most extraordinary thing that you should have a single man who should have played such a big part in all the three countries. But the people at the time recognized it, and when he crossed over here from England, they drove him out of the country here by saying his book was going to be prosecuted as an act of treason. But when he arrived on the French...
On roll number 2 was a roll off.
3.
Why won't this man die?
Well, of course they tried to kill him off during his lifetime, and the people thought they'd finished with him then. But for some reason, partly because, of course, he wrote in a kind of language that everybody could understand, partly for those reasons he was as popular as a film star or a rock star, and he was known throughout the whole of the political world of America and France and here in Britain. But then they tried to bury him, and it's a very interesting question as to why they should try to do it. Partly it was done by some of the historians who wanted to make the history something quite different, and therefore you had quite a number of history books written about these three revolutions in which Thomas Paine's name was almost erased. It's like the Stalinites in Russia who wanted to tell a history of the Soviet Union without the name of Trotsky being allowed to appear. And in the same way they thought, here we can tell the story, we'll tell the story of what happened in England or America and France without having Thomas Paine's name at all. But of course he always kept cropping up again, partly because of the actual way his actual writing took place. And his book, The Rights of Man, has been reprinted almost every decade, I think, since he actually wrote it. And after people were forgetting about him, and then along would come another edition, and people would see how up-to-date it was. One of the reasons for that also was because he was looking for the kind of social programs that he believed should be put into operation once he got the democracy. Once you got a government that really represented the people. He said there are lots of other things that they should be doing, a kind of government like that. And so he was pretty well the first person who said that a government ought to be providing for its old people, for its pensioners. He was the first old age pensioners proposal. Then he had proposals for how they should look after the poorer sections of the community and different kinds of social services. And then he had also special proposals, writing it way back 100 years ago or more, of how you should have proper plans for international arbitration instead of people going to war. He said he was a citizen of the world, and of course that's, I suppose, another of the reasons why he got into such trouble, because each country was saying, well, he doesn't belong to us, we think he's a traitor to us. The Americans were saying he's a traitor, we here in Britain were saying he's a traitor. In France they almost sent him to the guillotine. He was almost had the great distinction of being killed by the three countries, but the three countries in which he'd said the same things and had said them at the most awkward moments and had said them most bravely, but he was also at the time saying, here, let's look and see how we can make our world a real proper place. Then he got into terrible trouble, of course, because when he was in the French prison, and when he was might very well have been that he'd be taken out any morning and guillotined, he started there to write another book, a book not as great a book maybe as The Rights of Man, but it was a very fine book called The Age of Reason, in which he told the story of religion and how he thought some kinds of religion interfered with the rights of man and interfered with the kind of ways in which people should have a decent life. And of course, when he did this, he was denounced furiously from all quarters too. Another great American president, Teddy Roosevelt, said that he was a dirty little atheist and hoped that that was going to damn him too. And it did have great effects for quite a while, because a lot of people thought that Teddy Roosevelt was saying the truth. The facts were eventually pointed out to him, and it was proved he wasn't an atheist at all. He never was an atheist, whatever else he was, because he had written books in which he expressed his deism. But when this was pointed out to Teddy Roosevelt, well, the abuse had got so much that people didn't, that it still stuck. But so it took another few decades to wipe away that kind of smear against him. But now in these last 20 years or so, even the historians in the different parts of the world are coming round to realize what a major role it was, and so the knowledge that was kept alive by very few people is now becoming much more general here in this country. Yeah.
Okay, this is
This is wild quotations.
Okay.